Okay, nice to see you all early Saturday morning for a masterclass course on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, its text, manuscript and content. My name is, as most of you know, Aasgaard. I'm a professor at the University of Oslo in History of Ideas. And I've been working for some years on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. First, I would very much like to just say something more generally about my own reasons for studying the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Not because my research is anything special at all, but more because it's an example of what doing research is like, what it can be, and the challenges you meet when you do research. So I want it to be also an introduction partly into what it is doing research and being a researcher. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which tells the story about Jesus' childhood from 5 to 12, was a story that I had very little knowledge of some years ago, 7-8 years ago. Then I read it more closely and I found out that this was a really interesting text, an interesting story, but also a strange story in many ways, and within research, very much neglected. But I thought it was an interesting topic to pursue, also because I have for several years been working on family relations in antiquity, brother-sister relations, sibling relations, and I was looking for something to follow up on that, and found out that the matter of children would be also very interesting because they rarely come to the surface in the sources, and that it would be interesting to look at a text which dealt so very specially with a child or a child's life. To me, the studying and doing research on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas has been something like a discovery of something new. I feel that this research has been some kind of an expedition into a new field, a new area in many ways for myself as a scholar. I don't know whether the comparison holds, but it has almost, for me at least, been like finding the missing end of the Gospel of Mark, or suddenly discovering a manuscript of the Kvelde text, and then just going into it to see what is this kind of a text. And the reason why I had this sense of discovery is that I had a look at previous research on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And then I realized that very much, almost all of modern research really dealt with the text itself, the challenge about establishing the text. So much of the work had been done on some of the manuscripts, and where they had tried to see what is the original text that we're going to work with. If we're going to interpret the text or this story, we need to have some kind of an original text. So much of the scholarly energy was used on that. And the result of this was that there was very little research, in fact, on the contents of the story. Extremely little. Some of it was 100 years old and outdated in many ways, but also interesting. And there was also very little done on the context of the gospel. Beyond that, several scholars, as we talked about also yesterday, had put this into some kind of a category of heresy or heretical text, Gnostic text, or something like that. So I was there with a text with very little research on it, but with many interesting things that one could observe just by reading and looking a little more closely at it. And I had to ask myself how to study a text which almost doesn't exist, which has so many different kinds of variants and is so unstable, differs a lot from manuscript to manuscript. What to do about that? And this problem, I think, also has grown during the last 10, 20, 30 years because they have discovered even more manuscripts than earlier. 100 years ago, they had some manuscripts. Now they have many more, and also in different languages. So the problem became even bigger. What to do with the story if you're going to write anything on it when it differs so much? And I had to think about this. This is a problem, of course, that what kind of text you should work on. But why is that a problem? I also wanted to ask, does it really need to be a problem that we have so many different variants or versions or whatever of this text? Can we instead think that this is not a problem, but a potential? And I think that it is important to think about it as a potential, really. Can the differences, the fluent character of this text, help us understand, interpret this material, this kind of material, not only the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, but perhaps also similar text, in new ways? And I thought that this might be the case, that the diversity is not a problem, but it's really can be a gain. And I tried to approach the texts or the manuscripts to think about them as, instead of fixed manuscripts or fixed text, that we here have more collections of traditions, of narratives that were constantly changing, that were fluent, and how we should come to terms with that. I need to say something also about previous research, because I think the reason why previous research on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and also similar texts somehow gets into a cul-de-sac and doesn't get on is because, or get further, is that sometimes one has adopted too much of an approach where one is looking at the manuscripts as written texts and with a far too strong literary approach to them. This has been an inheritance, I think, from also New Testament textual criticism. I don't know how familiar you are with textual criticism of the New Testament, but there's been almost an obsession for periods, I think, in finding the original text. And very much of the energy has been put into this. But there has also been a change over the last 2-3 decades, not to only be interested in finding the original text, which can be important in many ways in itself as some kind of approach, but there's also been an interest in seeing how do the individual manuscripts, texts from different centuries, tell their own story. How can they be contextualized within their own context? So there's both an interest in the original text, but also in the manuscript traditions and the traditions of the texts. And that was something I also felt was very useful as some kind of a change or a shift, which could be applied on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, looking at the different shapes, forms of the text, and not be so fixed to finding the original text, which I think had really hampered Infancy Gospel of Thomas research in earlier decades. So I thought, what about instead seeing each of these stories, retellings of the episodes, stories about the young Jesus, what about seeing them as independent works, worth being studied in themselves as we find them in manuscripts? study them more or less individually as some kind of a tip of the iceberg, or different icebergs or different narrative traditions. So that was what I wanted to do, decide that if I should work on the text, the contents and its context, I really had to just go to one particular text, one particular witness to do that. And I decided to go for a text that you know very well, Sabbaticus 259, because I came across Tony Charton Burke's dissertation, where he had studied this text more closely. So I thought it was a good point of departure for work on the infancy gospel of Thomas. I might equally well have started with some of the other manuscripts, because what is the more ancient or older text of those texts, it's very difficult to say at all. We'll come back to that also later today. But I decided to go to the Sabbaticus, because I very much supported Burke's assessment of the text and its ancient character, and to interpret it from a variety of perspectives. And as I said, that was like somehow finding or going into a text which needed interpretation on a number of points and levels that hadn't been done. Before I started my study on the infancy gospel of Thomas, I had also for many years been very interested in methodologies in studying the New Testament, which you're well familiar with. I've been interested in more traditional historical critical approaches to the New Testament, social scientific approaches, and also ideological or ideology critical approaches, and narrative literary approaches. I was not an expert in those fields, but I'm generally very interested in those kinds of methodologies, what they could say in different ways about text and interpretation of text. So I decided, why not try to use all those kinds of approaches, or many of them at least, on the infancy gospel of Thomas. And here I had a text where I was able to deal with it from all these perspectives. So that was what I tried to do in the book, The Infancy or the Childhood of Jesus, Decoding the Apocryphal Infancy Gospel of Thomas, to approach the text from all these kinds of perspectives. And to me, this kind of work from different perspectives, I felt was very, very useful to be able to do that. I felt that we have within New Testament research really a great heritage for working on texts, that we are in many ways experts more than many others, because we have this limited group of texts which we need to get new meanings or new interpretations or try to approach in different ways, and that those kinds of tools are really a treasure for research. And I think not only, in fact, for New Testament studies, but also for studies of other types of texts. So that's a nice thing, and something I think that others would, who are not trained in those kinds of approaches, who could envy us a little at least, without saying anything wrong about all those other kinds of people who are trained in more special or other kinds of approaches. But being able to deal with text in that way is, the sum of those approaches become more than just those single approaches by themselves. So to me, working on this text, this material, has personal in many ways. Now I'm becoming a little personal also. It's been in many ways an adventure as a scholar, to be able to go on some kind of discovery travel expedition into new land and press on to learn new things about the text, and also to press myself as a scholar to enter fields where I do not really feel well or comfortable, but I had to somehow to press my own boundaries, and that was also very interesting, at least for me. Whether it has helped or done anything good for the book, I don't know. That's not the question, but it's just some kind of, I just want to formulate the experience of doing research and pressing oneself as a scholar to small steps further, whether some may say it's in the wrong direction, but okay, that's the way it is. So it's been a great thing really to be working on this material, and still is, because there's so much still to be done. I need to say also a little about why particularly this material on the childhood of Jesus, because that has also to do something about my involvement and interest as a scholar. It is not just that I come upon this material, which I think was interesting to study, but it also was something that I think for myself was important in many ways. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've been working quite a bit on family relations in antiquity, and what we might call a metaphorical understanding of family relations, where Christians see themselves as brothers and sisters, siblings, as part of some family, with perhaps Jesus as a big brother and God as fathers, or whatever. There are different models or ways of thinking about this. But I became, as I said, interested in doing more research on children as a group, because I realized they were a group that were very much on the margins, you might say, in antiquity, early Christianity, but also perhaps even more on the margins within modern research. So this was a new area that needed more study. That is, a lot of scholars have been realizing that before me, of course, also, but this was one of my interests. So I wanted to have this somehow then to also go into that kind of scholarly discourse. And I found out or thought that what could be more of a material fit for this kind of looking at childhood in antiquity than a story about Jesus as a child. Because Jesus would be one of the most important figures at all in this period, and iconic figure in many ways, and then to be able to deal with his childhood would be very interesting, even though it's not his real childhood. And it is also interesting to work with this, because we have from New Testament studies learned about the Jesus who blesses children, receives children, give them a place in the kingdom of God. But here is a text which is not that kind of Jesus, but is in fact Jesus as a child from that kind of perspective. And that would be very interesting to go into. So now I told you a little about my experience of what it was to do scientific work on this gospel, and the way I still feel it, and what it can make it so exciting in many ways and also important to do scholarly work, and how it also can be very rewarding, personally speaking. What I'm thinking that we shall do today is to try to press ourselves and each other in some of the same ways. I'm sure that you're more competent on some things than I am. I may be more competent on other things, and we have participants here who are experts in their fields. And I think and hope that this will be a workshop, some kind of collective endeavor where we join our expertise on the material and try to perhaps see new things, discover new things. In my book, which some of you know a bit of, others not so much. Many of you have presented or are going to present something from the book and from related material. But there I have sketched 4 main areas of research, which I thought was necessary to do partly in my book, but which I still think is fields that are equally relevant for further studies of this kind of material and also other similar sources. For example, also the Proto-Evangelium of James, which I've been talking about yesterday, and all other texts who can be dealt with in similar ways, I think. But there are 4 challenges, and just to mention them briefly, still what we can do with the text. And one is, which is a really demanding task, on the transmission history, the developments of narrative traditions, stories, etc., etc. It's really the amount of material is a challenge, but it's also a potential for many years of study, I think, and for many PhDs. So this, and we will go into this also later today with examples of differences among those recensions or variants of texts. You may have been looking at a little at it already earlier, I don't know, we'll come back to that, but we'll do that just a couple of examples today. And then I think also going into the story or the stories with a narrative perspective or literary narrative perspective, to see how these stories are told in different variants would be interesting. And the lecture yesterday, the lectures yesterday was really interesting because it dealt with different variant traditions in that way, and how the stories are structured differently in sequence of stories and things like that, sequence of episodes. And so that's the second area, and I think a challenge for further study. And the third area is more study of the theological and ideological profile of these texts or stories, which can in fact differ quite a lot from text to text or from language to language, because these are stories that were shaped according and adjusted according to the needs of those who wanted to tell those stories to others. And so we might find texts that really are very different when it comes to ideological thinking and theology. I'm just gone into one of those texts, the Sabaiticus mainly. And then also a question which I touched upon yesterday, where you probably now realize that there's a lot of things to do, and that was the matter about social setting or settings and audiences. What kind of people was this story intended for, or what the narrators, what kind of audience did they visualize that they would want to transmit or give this or forward this material to. So my book is then structured on these 4 main challenges, where I try to deal with the text from a social, scientific, narrative, and other approaches. And several of the chapters are also quite experimental, and we'll come back to that later today when you will be presenting, some of you, parts of the chapters, and we can discuss and debate and disagree and everything on matters there. Okay, I've said quite a bit about myself now, perhaps too much, I'm not sure. But I would also like that we could have a brief presentation round of the others of you who are participants here, before I go on saying a little more about the particular manuscript, the Sabaiticus 259. Now I want to say a little about the rationale or the plan for the day, just briefly. We're going to have 4 sessions. In this first session, we shall go on studying the original manuscript. In the second session, we are going to look at the different recensions and to compare them and think a little about why do we have this kind of differences, or why do we have this kind of text history for this kind of narrative traditions. And we'll also touch upon more contextual matters, which has to do with social setting, possible social settings for the text or the story. In the third session, we will go on also with social setting and questions related to that, but we will also particularly go more into theological matters about the understanding of Jesus, Christology, or also other matters related to this story. And in the fourth and final session, I've been planning that we will go into the more debated part, perhaps, of what this kind of story this is, whether this is some kind of a story intended also for children, or at least for children as an important group among the audience. And then we may also take up other topics in the last session. I would very much like to have some input on a book that I'm going to write, which will be a commentary, in fact, on the infant Gospel of Thomas, and it would be very useful to hear from you what you would think should be in such a book and what such a book should be like, because I really don't know and would like to have all the kind of input I can have. And you may also be having something that we would go into, and which I have not mentioned here, but that is the plan for the day. Now we will go a little into the manuscript itself. I will just first start by saying a little about the manuscript, very general. You have received a handout from your teacher, which with the heading Codex Sabbaticus 259, and you have also received copies, photocopies of the text, and we're going to look at that later. But this is just some general matters about the manuscript itself. You may already be familiar with some of those things, but nevertheless. When I started studying this manuscript, I had not studied one single ancient manuscript at all myself. So this was really a new field to enter into, and quite demanding, I would say. I had for a long time been interested in New Testament textual criticism, so that was a field that I'm fairly familiar with, but really going into individual manuscripts and working on them, that was a big challenge. New field, interesting, exciting. So I just had to get hold of the text. That was a challenge in itself also. And that's, I think, is the experience of many scholars doing research on manuscript, to really just to get them. Sometimes one has to go there to the library or whatever it is and take copies or photographs or something of them oneself. But often it's also on microfilms and things like that. Or some are also even published on internet. Many of the New Testament, central New Testament manuscripts are published on the internet, in fact, so you can read them there in facsimile editions. But I had to get a microfilm. That was my first microfilm in this life. And that was also interesting to go into that. And the manuscript that you have is a printout of or some kind of photo of this microfilm. The manuscript itself is located in Jerusalem, Library of the Patriarchate in Jerusalem. Never been there myself, but they sent me the microfilm. I got it. I didn't get it from there, sorry. I think I got it from an American library. In fact, they had it there too. So this kind of information is something you will find in text-critical editions or other articles. If you need to find an original manuscript and to have a copy of it, you need to go to those kind of sources. And the book by Burke has also an overview of those kind of things. People that work with manuscripts, text editions and things like that, they have a certain system which they follow when writing down information of where you can find manuscripts, etc., and what shape the manuscripts are in. This is a parchment codex, and it's not a very big one, but fairly. It's 260 by 212 millimeter in size. It consists of 317 leaves, not pages, but leaves. So it's quite many pages. So the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is just a small part of this. In fact, it's a much bigger manuscript. And the text is written in 2 columns, and also in the scriptio continua. Everything follows with very few signs of stops and things like that, paragraphs and whatever. That's what's a common way of doing it. Differently from many other manuscripts, the Codex Sabbaticus is dated, so we know what time it is from. It is from 1089 and 1090. So it's from the early high Middle Ages and much later than the story itself, the narrative itself. We'll come back to challenges in that connection later. The Codex Sabbaticus is also the earliest Greek manuscript containing the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and that was probably one of the main reasons, or a main reason why Tony Burke also chose this as his point of departure in his original dissertation. The book and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas was probably copied in a monastery in Cyprus, and then later transferred to Jerusalem because Cyprus was under the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. We even know the name of the scribe who made the manuscript, and his name was Gerasimos, and he was a monk. There is some damage on the manuscript, so some pieces are missing, also in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas part, and there are a number of misspellings also. So Burke and other experts on the language and on the manuscripts say this Gerasimos, he was a not very skilled or very learned scribe. He did many mistakes, at least according to the ancient standard of Greek, the classical Greek, and also partly the Koine. But it might not have been mistakes in the sense of how they spoke and how they wrote, because there was not a standard as we have in German or Norwegian of writing or doing grammar. It was more based upon local traditions and the language people spoke. So it's somehow anachronistic to say that he did many misspellings or things like that. He wrote the way he perhaps heard or spoke himself in very many ways. But there are nevertheless some misspellings. But yeah, when you write a manuscript of 317 2 times or pages, then there will be many misspellings, a lot of things many ways that things can go wrong. The manuscript contains also a lot of different works, not only the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And within Infancy Gospel of Thomas research and the research on apocryphal material, this is also interesting to see what kind of material is together with those kind of more contested or problematic texts, because that would tell something about the status of these texts. And there's much to say about this on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. I won't say much here, but what we see at least in Codex Sabbaticus is that the text is together with also other apocryphal texts, but also among texts which have a high status in this period. And that's interesting because it says something about how to assess those texts and how they perhaps looked upon them. In fact, I have a PhD student for the time being who's working on different variants of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and in different languages, and she's also looking on this part of the manuscript tradition. What kind of manuscripts is the infancy, or the text is together with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas? What does this tell of the attitude towards this text in the different examples of manuscripts? We find in Codex Habaeticus texts by, you can see on the handout, by Basil of Caesarea, homilies, John Chrysostom was very highly valued, particularly in the East, Epiphanius, an important early father also, and Ephraim the Syrian also, and also variety of hagiographical writings, which also were popular and in high esteem among early Christians and medieval Christianity also. So it is in a manuscript placed there among other highly regarded texts also.